Hi, I'm Jackie Knowles of Glasswork Pixie, partnering with Oceanside Glass and Tile to bring you this instructional Fusing Fundamentals video series. During this supplementary lesson, I'll be walking through 3 of the most common and most frustrating issues that beginner fusers face: bubbles, devitrification, and cracks. And I'll provide you with potential solutions for each one. Let's start problem solving. Bubbles are a frustration that nearly every fuser will run into at some point. They can appear quite obviously as large or small bubbles visible on the surface of a piece. They can present as slight bumps, sometimes called mumps, that aren't obviously seen, but that can be felt on the surface of a piece. And in the case that they burst through the glass during firing, they can even leave their evidence as a hole in the finished piece. There are a few different ways to prevent bubble formation, depending on which type you're seeing in your projects. If you're seeing several obvious bubbles on the surface of a piece, or small mumps that you can feel on its surface, this is likely due to air becoming trapped between the glass layers. As we learned in Lesson 4, when multiple layers are fired, their outer perimeters will soften before their intersections, creating a seal that traps air in the center, which can result in bubbles. To prevent this, you can try introducing a bubble squeeze into your firing schedule to slow the initial heating of the glass in order to give the upper layers enough time to evenly settle down onto the lower ones, thus allowing air to escape laterally from between the layers. Revisit Lesson 4 of this series for an in-depth explanation of bubble squeezes. If you're seeing a single large bubble, mump, or hole isolated to one section of your project and that can be seen or felt on the underside of the glass, this is likely due to air becoming trapped between the kiln shelf, or whatever surface the glass is sitting on, and the glass itself. To prevent this, make sure your kiln shelf or mold is completely dry before placing your project onto it. Moisture within a surface will evaporate during firing, rising upward and bubbling through the glass above it. If you've prepped your shelf with kiln wash, follow the manufacturer's recommended firing schedule to fully dry it after it's been applied. Also, make sure to store your kiln shelves and molds in a safe, dry environment so they don't accumulate moisture when they're not in use. These types of bubbles can also be caused by an uneven firing surface. Closely inspect kiln shelves and molds to make sure they don't have any chips, cracks, or divots that may act as air pockets. If you're using a shelf, inspect both sides carefully and build your project on the one that appears smoother. If you find the air firing surface is irreparably damaged on both sides, you can try placing a piece of fiber paper between it and the glass to create a breathable layer that will allow air bubbles to escape. Old layers of fired kiln wash can also create uneven surfaces on shelves and molds. So when removing used kiln wash, make sure to remove it completely and evenly, and aim for the same consistency when reapplying fresh coats. If you're using a mold, make sure its vent holes are clear and not clogged with primer. For an in-depth tutorial of exactly how to apply and remove kiln wash with both shelves and molds, revisit Lesson 7 of this series. If you've added a bubble squeeze to your firing schedule, properly prepped your firing surface, and are still seeing bubbles, it may be that they're being introduced by poor design. To resolve this, modify your design such that all glass layers sit flat. This means avoiding accessory glasses in between layers, avoiding textured glasses in between layers or face down against the kiln shelf, and avoiding uneven weight distribution, such as stacked glass along the outer edges of a multi-layer project, which will weigh down the perimeter and trap air in the center, even with a bubble squeeze. You may also need to remove any large expanses of uncut glasses atop each other by incorporating pathways by which air can escape. This means that instead of firing two solid layers of glass together, ensure one of the layers includes several cuts that route air to the outer edges. Finally, it's important to realize that very small bubbles are virtually unavoidable due to the inherent nature of glass fusing. These are sometimes referred to as champagne bubbles, and they accentuate the character and handmade quality of fused glass pieces. Embrace them. Devitrification, also called devit, is a common fusing issue that presents as a cloudy, scummy haze on the surface of freshly fired pieces. Although it looks like soap scum that can just be wiped away, it's actually the growth of small crystalline structures within or on the surface of glass that no amount of scrubbing will remove. A common cause of devit is firing unclean glass. Oil from fingertips or glass cutters, residue from markers, stickers, or glues, and compounds from fiber papers burnt off during firing or left over from previous firings are all potential contaminants that can trigger devitrification. To prevent this, make sure to thoroughly clean your glass before putting it in the kiln. You can revisit Lesson 6 of this series to get an in-depth tutorial on cleaning glass prior to firing. But in general, best practices for cleaning include 1. Using fresh cloths and agents like isopropyl alcohol and/or distilled vinegar to clean glass, while avoiding agents that have dyes or perfumes that may introduce contamination. 2. Only handling your glass with gloved hands once it's ready for firing. And 3. Firing glass immediately after it's been cleaned so it doesn't have time to collect residue. Even if your glass is perfectly clean upon entering the kiln, devit-triggering contaminants could be introduced during the firing itself, depending on what else you put in the kiln. Materials like fiber paper, refractory molds, glues, or potentially any other non-glass items you fire along with your project can contain compounds that burn off at high temperatures. As these compounds burn off, they may come into contact with the glass and trigger devit. To prevent this, vent your kiln lid slightly whenever firing these types of materials to allow any burn-off to escape. You may also want to consider removing these kinds of materials entirely if they're not absolutely essential to the outcome of your project. Devitrification can also be caused by holding glass too long within the temperature range at which it's vulnerable to crystal growth. This is referred to as the devit zone and is generally considered any temperature above 1350 degrees Fahrenheit. This devit trigger can be prevented by using a firing schedule that minimizes the amount of time glass is held above 1350 degrees. If a project's process temperature is above this degree, don't raise it any higher than absolutely necessary, and keep the process soak hold time as short as possible. For instance, although you could achieve a full fuse by heating a project to 1500 degrees and holding it there for an hour, you could likely also achieve the result you want by instead heating it to the very start of its full fusing range, say 1460 degrees Fahrenheit, and holding it there for around 10 minutes. As a general guideline for modifying firing schedules to prevent devitrification, projects held at low temperatures for long periods will minimize devit and can produce similar aesthetics to projects held at high temperatures for short periods. You may have to perform experiments in your kiln to validate the exact balance between firing temperature and firing duration that produces your desired aesthetic and avoids devit. Lesson 2 of this series provides an in-depth breakdown of which firing temperature ranges result in which aesthetics for Oceanside Compatible glass, which may be helpful to revisit if you're trying to create firing schedules that minimize devit potential. One last method of preventing devitrification is to consider swapping the types of glass you're using in your project. Glasses from a reputable manufacturer that have been factory tested for compatibility tend to be more resistant to devit than those that haven't been, So use sheets marked as compatibility tested, like those from Oceanside Compatible, whose fusing formulas are specifically made DVIT resistant for extra insurance. Also be aware that opalescent glass is more prone to DVIT than transparent, and certain colors may be more prone than others. If you're having a tough time with DVIT, consider changing up your project's color palette for a potential improvement. If you've done everything possible to prevent devitrification, but you still open the kiln to a DVIT-covered project, don't worry, you may be able to save it. One way to do so is to use a sifter to sprinkle a thin layer of clear powder frit across the project's entire surface, and then refire it up to a full fuse. The new frit layer should be applied evenly and so that it just covers the project's surface. After refiring, it will have melted into a new glossy layer that helps hide the original devitrified layer underneath. Another way to save a project is to refire it with a new top layer of transparent sheet glass. However, be aware that this will significantly increase the weight of the project and could cause it to expand past its original size. Recall the 6mm rule we learned about in Lesson 4 that dictates if a project's thickness is above 6mm, it will expand outward if not constrained. Another major issue beginner fusers will likely face is an unexpected crack or break in a finished piece. As we discussed in Lesson 2, glass is particularly vulnerable to cracking when fired within both the thermal shock zone, which is the temperature range below 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the anneal strain zone, which is around the range of 800 to 950 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the COE of the glass. You may be able to tell which of these temperature ranges a piece broke within, depending on the look of its edges upon opening the kiln. If the broken edges are soft and rounded, the break likely occurred during the heating segments because the separate pieces then fired through the process temperature and rounded out. If the broken edges are crisp, the break likely occurred during the annealing or cooling segments because the separate pieces didn't get hot enough afterward to round out. If the crack occurred during the heating segments of a firing, the rate of the initial heat phase should be decreased. The exact amount of decrease will depend on the size and thickness of your project, but a rate of around 100 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit per hour should be slow enough to prevent cracks in most projects. If the crack occurred during the annealing or cooling segments of a firing, the anneal soak hold time should be increased long enough for the project to fully equalize to its annealing temperature. The rates of the anneal cool and room temperature cool phases should be slowed down, and you should make sure not to open the kiln before room temperature is reached, no matter how tempting it may be. The exact changes to the anneal soak hold time and the cooling rates will depend on the size and thickness of your project, but a hold of 60 minutes and a rate of around 100 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit per hour should be long enough and slow enough for most projects. If you're using Oceanside Compatible glass, you can reference the Firing Schedules document, Thick Firing Schedules document, and the Refiring Thick Previously Fired Work document, all provided on their website, to determine the appropriate firing schedule rates and hold times for your project, whatever its thickness. Also be aware that if stress within glass isn't properly relieved during the cooling segments of a firing, the finished piece can break while still in the kiln, or as a nasty surprise at any time in the future, even if it seemed fine after being removed from the kiln. If you want to be absolutely confident that a piece will remain intact, it's a good idea to check it for signs of instability. Revisit Lesson 3 of this series to learn how to do so using polarization filters. The last common cause of cracks or breaks is fusing incompatible glasses together. Incompatible glasses will expand and contract at different rates when fired, causing them to crack apart. You can once again refer to Lesson 3 of this series for an in-depth explanation of compatibility and how to test for it, But a general guideline is to construct your project entirely from glass of the same COE from the same manufacturer. To completely eliminate the possibility of incompatibility cracks, some artists choose to keep their studio stocked exclusively with a single manufacturer's glass. And Oceanside Compatible products are a perfect option if you decide to go that route. But if you prefer to mix it up, keep your glasses neatly separated and organized to decrease the chances of incompatible ones getting shuffled into the same project. I hope this information helps you overcome any of the hurdles you may have run into as you've started fusing, and that it gets you prepared for a few you haven't faced yet. Remember that failure is a great learning opportunity, and it leads to improvement if approached correctly. If you found this supplementary lesson helpful, be sure to check out the 2 others within this series that cover glass fusing safety and designing fused glass patterns.